Hey, welcome into a special episode of Texans on Tap. I'm Brandon Strange. That's Josh Jordan. Follow him on X at JoshJordan975. No Charlie today. He will be back with us soon. Josh, Super Bowl Sunday. Texans have aspirations of getting there one day, hopefully very soon. And for the first time in several years, they actually have the coaching staff and some elite players that make that a much more realistic proposition. And as you and I were talking about after the game, there were some really important lessons learned from the Super Bowl that we think that probably apply to the Texans or really any team that's has aspirations to get to the Super Bowl. But for the Texans specifically, there's some real special things there or some specific things that would apply to them. So let's start with the most important position, and that's having that elite quarterback, because we saw that was on display. Super important to have an elite quarterback. And we saw Patrick Mahomes again come up in the biggest moments. What were your takeaways and how do they apply to what the Texans have with CJ Stroud?
Well, what got me excited is, could the Texans possibly have the best of both worlds of those two teams eventually, where it looks like they had the franchise quarterback. Obviously, he's not Pat Mahomes, but as far as for a rookie season goes, you can't ask for much more for what his upside could be. And then you look at D'Amico and that defense and that 49ers defense you saw in the Super Bowl with a Bosa coming off the edge, and Texans are going to have Will Anderson coming off the edge, hopefully for years to come. So could the Texans build a 49ers type defense, but then also have the elite quarterback that the Chiefs have? I mean, the sky is the limit if they can put that together. So I think that's going to be huge. The elite defense factor, the Chiefs defense was fantastic, 49ers as well. Texans, they finished a little, around top 10 in the league, but if they can get to maybe around top 5 in the league, I think that's the next step they could take. And my other huge takeaway was tight ends, man. I was looking at that. Kelsey didn't do anything in the first half. What do you have? 1 yard receiving with 1 catch. Kittle for the whole game was god awful. Like, he did basically nothing in that game. So Kelsey was the difference in the second half. And as we look at those two dynasties with Tom Brady and Patrick Mahomes, what's that common ground there? Well, maybe they didn't have the best receivers in the world, but they had probably, I don't even know if it's arguable, the two best tight ends in the history of the NFL, in Gronk and Travis Kelce. So as I look at the Texans roster and Dalton Schultz being a free agent this year, he's no Kelce, he's no Gronk, but he's still a good tight end. And when I look around who's going to be a free agent this year, the best option outside of Schultz is Hunter Henry, who played with the Patriots. He only had 419 yards receiving. So, and when you draft tight ends, typically they take a few years to develop. It's not a position you learn right away. So I think if the Texans want to continue this, keep the offense firing, I think bringing Dalton Schultz back is going to be a top priority.
Yeah. So I want to hit on a couple of those things you talked about. So how many times did we see Mahomes improvise and make a play? It wasn't just about a play call. It was about, moving the pocket, being able to get his receivers or use his eyes to free up his guys or run when he needed to. So I really was encouraged by that, because I know the Texans have a guy who can do that. We haven't really seen him use his wheels the way that we see Mahomes do it in games. And so, but from an improvisation standpoint, I think CJ Stroud in his first season was among the best. And so I'm really excited to see how they can build on that. As far as the elite defense part of it goes, how big was it when the 49ers were driving early in that game and the Chiefs were able to turn them over in the red zone? That was such a gigantic momentum turn, because it just felt like an event. That touchdown was an eventuality. And for the Chiefs to be able to, for their defense to be able to stand up in the red zone and to be able to keep points off the board was huge. And so that's why I definitely agree with you. I'm really excited to see what D'Amico will be able to do with some pieces in this defense, because we saw what he was able to do just from a pure coaching standpoint, to take a lot of the same guys and take a team that was last place in run defense and get them into the top 6 by the end of the season. That's amazing, with really, not a whole lot of, interchanging out pieces. So tip of the hat to D'Amico and tip of the hat to guys like Sheldon Rankins and guys who really just played, outside themselves this year. I like your point about the tight end, obviously. Here's what I kind of took away too, is I think there's a lesson in this Super Bowl about not outsmarting yourself. There's a narrative around Kyle Shanahan that he is a very gifted, very smart play caller, one of the best offensive coordinators we've ever seen, and now obviously a coveted head coach, but not being able to win the big one. That's something that's kind of that's following him right now. And there were times Sunday in which Shanahan kind of went away from the things that worked. And then also he didn't really have an answer to the adjustments that the Chiefs defense was making. Bobby Slowick comes from that Shanahan tree. He comes from that coaching tree. And there were times during this season in which I thought the Texans were just dead set on getting the running game going, especially remember early on when they just continued to call Dameon Pierce's number over and over again when it clearly wasn't working. And, they kind of were, bullheaded about going with Singletary. But even when they went with Singletary, like I think, going to that Ravens game, and again, like that's a tough scale to measure yourself by because the Ravens are just so elite. But that is what you're measuring yourself by because that's what your aspirations are. And if you're going to get to the Super Bowl, you're going to have to beat teams like Baltimore. But Texans in that game choose to receive, run, pass, punt, very Kubiak feel to it. And then on the passing side of it, look, there's no doubt that Bobby Slowick deserves a ton of credit for his work with CJ Stroud. I don't want to take anything away from what happened in that pass game, but I think it's fair to ask how much of the success that CJ had on offense in the passing game was on CJ just being an elite quarterback and making really good decisions. Because how many times did we see him have to improvise? That goes back to that improvisation thing, that being that elite quarterback thing that we see from Mahomes, in which Mahomes just had to make something out of nothing. And there's the same thing with CJ, I thought, where there were times in which he just made the very best out of a bad situation, whether it was throwing across his body on his back heels or just, letting a play develop or letting a guy get open and finding a guy as he's, kind of running and extending a play or running to the outside of a pocket. So, that's just kind of what I saw from, that standpoint of the play calling. Don't outsmart yourself. And I think from another side of the ball was special teams. What did you see from special teams as far as like lessons learned there and how important it is?
Well, we know about the Keamy Fairbairn missed field goal try that would have put the Texans ahead of the Ravens at halftime. We saw the Niners miss, an extra point attempt that got blocked that was crucial in that game. And with the Chiefs, Butker is just nails, and from deep field goals, man, at like 50, 53, 55 yards seems like nothing to him. And Fairbairn's he's a free agent. He's going to be somebody they have to make a decision on this offseason. And he commands a decent amount of money. And this is going to be a second contract for him if they go that route. I almost wonder if maybe you look at trying to draft somebody, maybe that would be a cheaper option. I hate to see so much money spent on special teams. And to your point about, Slowick, I thought he did a great job as well, but CJ's a big part of that. We saw what the offense looked like when Case Keenum and Davis Mills were taking snaps when Stroud was dealing with that concussion. So that's certainly part of it. And I think, back to when to use the run game, maybe Shanahan got away from it a little bit when they had several 3-and-outs in that Super Bowl. In the third quarter, they couldn't get much going. They kind of went away from McCaffrey. But I also noticed, too, Stroud is one of the guys that throws to his running backs the least out of quarterbacks and in this offense. And remember, we're saying throughout the year, like, let's try and get the ball to Singletary. And as much as we think McCaffrey had a great game in the Super Bowl, Chiefs held him to 3.6 yards per carry. He had 80 yards, but was on 22 attempts. But how did he have an awesome, effective game through the air? He had 8 catches for 80 yards. So I know every running back you have is not going to be Christian McCaffrey, but if they can find somebody that's a quality pass catcher and just add that element to the offense, I think that would make a big difference. And special teams is always huge. And the Texans are good at it. They have one of the best coaches in that area. So, and let's face it, as much as we kind of don't like the games to ride on kickers, we want to see touchdown passes and explosive plays. It is called football, and a lot of games come down to that field goal. I mean, how many Super Bowls did Tom Brady win on that last drive of the Super Bowl based on an Adam Vinatieri field goal? It's a big part of the game, so we'll see. But it worries me a little bit. Fairbairn, he missed a few in some critical situations, but typically he's nails. But in some of these stressful situations, he hasn't come through. So I'm curious to see what Caserio is going to do with him.
I know I'm going to get destroyed in the comments for criticizing. Look, I just want to say I'm glad that the Texans were able to retain Bobby Slowick this coaching cycle. I'm glad for the continuity. I think Bobby Slowick is a good offensive coordinator. I'm just saying it's a fair question to ask. How much is attributed to CJ? That's all I'm saying. And Josh, you were obviously banging the drum all season about passing to running backs. And if anyone questions that, we have an endless amount of episodes of, that for Texans on Tap that you can go back and watch and see that. It was basically an episodic event where you were banging the drum of get the ball to the running back in whatever way you can, including in the passing game. And then going back to that special teams thing, Cam Johnston, how big was he for the Texans this season and the field position game, getting Texans out of their own territory and then also pinning opponents deep into their territory? That was a huge part of what they did this season. And, Charlie, we talked about it on some of these games where Cam was close to being player of the game in a lot of these because it was so pivotal, in that field position game, especially in the more lower scoring games in which you really needed every yard counted. And Cam was a huge weapon for you in special teams. And then I think, lastly, one of the things that was pretty glaring was the penalties in the Super Bowl. We saw Trent Williams, who by every account, who's an elite left tackle, but he sure did his best Laramie Tunsil impression at times. Yep. And by the way, look, Laramie is also a great player, but he can also be predispositioned to moving early. What did you see from the penalty side of things that, is kind of telling or educational for the Texans and their aspirations to reach the Super Bowl?
Yeah, it reminded me of that 49ers first drive, the Texans against the Ravens. Remember, the Texans shot themselves in the foot over and over again. Pretty much, I mean, the offensive line, they're a good offensive line, but they did not play well in that Ravens game. I don't know if there was a guy that didn't have a false start, and you had some holding penalties. And with the 49ers, I think Williams had a false start. I know he had a holding in that first drive. And then, of course, McCaffrey fumbling when they kind of get down there close to scoring. So it's just self-inflicted wounds, and I felt like the Texans had a lot of those against the Ravens, and it was kind of a game of two halves, right? Both games against the Ravens, the Texans kept it close in the first half, and then they just kind of got their doors blown off in the second half. And with the 49ers and the Chiefs, we saw a different Chiefs team come out in that second half. Kelsey started taking over the game. And one of the biggest, Chris Jones, I mean, he's one of the best defensive players in the league. He had a huge hit on Purdy, putting pressure on him where they pretty much had it look like a touchdown dialed up. And Chris Jones just got in there and didn't let him get it off on time the way he wanted to. That was something I noticed with the Texans too, that they kind of struggled to get pressure because Grenard was playing through an injury. Will Anderson was playing through an injury.
Yeah.
They just needed, especially, and up the middle, they need a little more. I like what Sheldon Rankins did and Malik Collins, but I think they could use another playmaker up there to really put the heat on the opposing quarterback.
Well, it's going to be really exciting to see. Obviously, we're all anxious to see what happens to free agency. We're all anxious to see what happens in the draft. And as those things unfold, make sure you come back here and you're watching us on Texans on Tap and you're subscribed to us on the Sports Map Texans channel on YouTube. Charlie's going to be back with us next time. For Josh, I'm Brandon. Appreciate you watching. Thank you so much. Go Texans.